Hi, I'm Dr. Matt Goldstone, and in this series we're exploring the Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Matthew in light of early Jewish literature.
In this third video, we'll be looking at the last two antitheses in chapter 5 of the Sermon on the Mount, which discuss the law of eye for an eye and love of others. The fifth antithesis begins by quoting the law of lex talionis, or an eye for an eye. The Gospel then reports Jesus saying that you should not resist an evil person, but rather, if they slap you, you should accept it and turn the other cheek. Matthew goes on to say that if someone wants to take your shirt from you, you should give it willingly and even hand over your coat as well. The point is that you should give to anyone who asks and lend to anyone who wishes to borrow. The last antithesis begins with an altered version of the commandment to love your fellow from Leviticus 19:18. In the Gospel, this saying is framed as loving your neighbor and hating your enemy. Jesus, however, is presented as arguing that you should love everyone, especially your enemy.
We can see a strong link between these last two antitheses. Jesus encourages his audience to always offer love, even in response to violence. But why does the Gospel use the specific examples of being slapped and giving to anyone who asks? The answer perhaps lies in an ancient interpretation of two verses from the book of Leviticus.
Leviticus 19:17 commands that you shall not hate your kinsfolk, but instead you should reprove them. The following verse, Leviticus 19:18, goes on to add that you should not take vengeance or bear a grudge, but you should love your fellow as yourself.
When we turn to the interpretation of these verses, in the early rabbinic midrash known as Sifra, we find a number of intriguing parallels to the last two antitheses in the Gospel of Matthew.
Commenting on Leviticus 19:17, Sifra suggests that you might think that Leviticus's prohibition on hatred also forbids cursing, hitting, and slapping someone. But actually, the midrash informs us that the verse only directly prohibits internalized hatred in one's heart. Turning to Leviticus 19:18, Sifra provides us with an example of what it means to take vengeance against someone. Until what point is vengeance? He said to him, "Lend me your sickle," and he did not lend it. The next day he said to him, "Lend me your axe," and he said to him, "I will not lend you, just as you did not lend me your sickle." Sifra's example of vengeance equates vengeance with not lending to another person. Sifra goes on to present another relevant interpretation of Leviticus 19:18. Specifically, the midrash limits Leviticus's prohibition on vengeance to vengeance against your people, but permits taking vengeance on others. Sifra's comments on this verse conclude by highlighting the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, which Rabbi Akiva declares to be a great principle of the Torah.
There are a number of important similarities between the interpretation of Leviticus 19:17-18 in Sifra and the last two antitheses in the Gospel of Matthew.
Matthew starts by talking about a person slapping you, and Sifra includes one who slaps you in the list of activities not prohibited by the verse. The Gospel goes on to say that you should give to anyone who wants to borrow, and Sifra understood vengeance to be about lending and borrowing. Finally, the last antithesis refers to the command to love your neighbor, which Jesus extends to your enemy, while the tradition in Sifra quotes the verse from Leviticus, but specifically excludes others like your enemy.
There's a parallel to these two Matthean antitheses in the Gospel of Luke, which offers an even greater resemblance to the tradition in Sifra.
In Luke chapter 6, Jesus tells his listeners to do good to those who hate you, which reminds us of the prohibition on hatred in Leviticus. To bless those who curse you, Sifra included cursing a person, and to allow a person to strike you. Again, Sifra refers to someone hitting or slapping you. Luke goes on to talk about lending and borrowing, like we saw in Matthew. And Luke also concludes by referencing the commandment to love others, especially your enemies. In Luke, the similarities to the tradition in Sifra are even more apparent.
It seems likely that the interpretation of Leviticus 19:17-18 found in the midrash is an older tradition that dates back to the time of the Gospels or even earlier.
This interpretive tradition connects Leviticus 19:17's prohibition on hatred to hitting, cursing, and slapping. It understands Leviticus 19:18's prohibition on vengeance to refer to borrowing and lending, and it suggests that the verse permits you to treat your people differently than others. And of course, Leviticus 19:18 itself includes the commandment referenced in Matthew that you should love your neighbor.
Both Luke 6 and the last two antitheses in Matthew 5 show a strong connection to the interpretive tradition found in Sifra. Of course, the fifth antithesis in Matthew refers to the law of eye for an eye from Exodus, and not a verse from Leviticus. However, the fact that there's a direct parallel to this section of Matthew in the Gospel of Luke, which does not mention the law of eye for an eye, suggests that this interpretive tradition predates the Gospel of Matthew, and was later connected to the verse from Exodus when this antithesis was being formed.
To recap, the interpretation of Leviticus 19:17 in Sifra forbade hatred, but permits cursing, hitting, and slapping, and all these actions are collectively found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. When it comes to Leviticus 19:18, all three texts describe lending and borrowing. Sifra specifically allowed vengeance against others, like the tradition of hating your enemy recorded in Matthew. Finally, Sifra, Matthew, and Luke all emphasize the importance of love. These many points of connection suggest that Sifra and the Gospels are all drawing upon the same interpretation of Leviticus 19:17 through 18, which helps us to better understand the last two antitheses in the Sermon on the Mount. For more on this particular example, including discussion of the hypothetical document known as Q, see my article Rebuke, Lending, and Love, an early exegetical tradition on Leviticus 19:17 through 18 in the Journal of Biblical Literature.